This is one of a series of Good Answers presentations, offering evidence to answer skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. One of the chief ways in which biblical history differs from secular history is in its account of a great flood sent by God to cleanse a sinful world. Now, of course, the geological record makes it certain that there have been floods in the past. But secular geologists generally explain the immense amount of sedimentary rock around the globe as a record of countless floods over millions of years, not a single globe-drowning catastrophe. Other lectures in this series treat geology as it informs this question. But this talk will ask whether human memory helps us to answer the question, was there a great flood like Noah's? Most of us are familiar with the account as we find it in Genesis. God reveals to Noah, a righteous man, that because of the depth of depravity to which the human race has sunk, he is going to destroy the world with a flood. Noah is to do his best to warn his people of the coming catastrophe, even though there's little likelihood that they'll heed him. And over the coming years, more than a century, he is also to construct an enormous boat according to instructions that God provides. Its size will be necessary because it will have to accommodate a pair of every kind of air-breathing animal, and even 7 pairs of those animals considered clean and available for sacrifice. Then the rain begins, 40 days of it, and the fountains of the great deep are broken up as well, releasing even more water to flood the earth. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives are confined within the ark for more than a year. But God protects them through the disaster, and eventually the ark grounds in the mountains of Ararat. After sending out a raven and a dove to test the receding waters, Noah is finally able to open the ark and release its contents. His first act is to offer a sacrifice of thanks to God, and in the rainbow he sees God's promise that he will never again destroy the earth with water. Can this story actually be true? If it is, then there are a few important truths that we would have to accept. First, all the earth was flooded. The biblical account is very clear on this point. Second, all people, with the exception of Noah's family, died, and all air-breathing animals who were not in the ark also perished. Third, since only Noah's family survived to repopulate the earth, then everyone alive today will have descended from that family. Fourth, and most relevant to our subject today, all cultures in the world are most likely to have some racial memory of a great flood. And as for racial memories of that flood, maybe we do indeed have them. As we look into the myths and legends of Incas and Maori, of Assyrians and Chinese, of Navajos and Gypsies, of Yakima and Maasai, of Greeks, Chippewas, and Aztecs, we find a striking pattern. All include exaggerations, distortions, or omissions of various kinds, but they contain much detail that only makes sense if we conclude that they all derive from a common source. Because researchers have different standards for determining whether a given legend does fit this pattern, they arrive at different total numbers of such tales. But we commonly read of some 270 flood stories from around the globe. But before we examine any of these, a word of caution. For many years, I taught classical mythology at the university level. I had to make clear to my students that these tales have been passed down to us through oral tradition, and for that reason they've been subject to various kinds of distortion. In fact, they grow and change from generation to generation. We must therefore expect that any story that has come through several generations orally will have experienced significant change. It may even contain some outright howling errors. Here's an example. Around AD 1090, a Norman poet named Thorold gave us a poem called the Chanson de Roland. It is a tale of bloodshed and heroics from an event 300 years before, when the Muslims were sweeping out of the east, conquering North Africa, and pouring into Italy and Spain. Back then, in about 778, Charlemagne was campaigning in Spain. As his army was returning through the Pyrenees, they were ambushed at a pass in Roncesvalles. The poem tells how his brave knight Roland, commanding the rear guard, held out against the Saracen attackers, continuing his resistance until he was at last cut down. Hence the stirring Song of Roland. It was told and retold through 300 years of oral tradition, and, like the Greek tale of the Spartans at Thermopylae, or the Roman saga of Horatius at the bridge, it served to inspire many a young man to seek glory in battle. But the heroism of Roland against the Muslim hordes has one significant problem. The historians know better. Here's a typical textbook comment. Quote, "Over the years, the battle was romanticized by oral tradition into a major conflict of Christians and Muslims, when in fact both sides of the battle were Christian, Franks and Basques." Well then, there was a real battle in the past at Roncesvalles, but some significant elements were lost in transmission. So as we proceed, let's remember that we are not examining sober history in the world's cabinet of memories. This is myth country. So then, as we look at these tales, what reality can we expect may lie behind them? Some will say there's not any one reality there, but several. After all, floods are common occurrences. We should expect just about every culture to have stories about them. More about that in a moment. And it may also be pointed out that missionaries have gone throughout the world for many years now. Tales of a flood in some third world tribe may actually be just a garbled version of what Christian missionaries tried to teach them from the Bible. And that may indeed explain some of the tales we find. But the third possibility is that we will find multiple traces of a real flood, the one the Bible records in Genesis. Now about that first objection, are floods indeed so common that we will find tales about them among all of the world's peoples? For many, sure. But how about Native Americans who have always lived in the Rocky Mountains? They would have experienced a flash flood in a valley, perhaps, lasting a couple of hours. But how much of a legend would that produce? Or the Incas in the Andes of Peru? Or tribes who lived for centuries in the Alps? Or perhaps the Sherpas dwelling on the slopes of Mount Everest? And we might also ask about the deserts of the world. The Berbers, denizens of the Sahara, what experience would they have had with floods? Or the Gobi Desert, home of the Mongols from ancient times? or the nomadic tribes who call the Arabian desert home. Floods are certainly common in the river valleys of the world, but we are unlikely to come across hundreds of legends based on local floods in the mountainous and desert regions of our world, and least of all, stories masquerading as worldwide disasters. But then, a skeptic may remind us about missionary influence. Perhaps their attempt to teach Genesis resulted in some twisted version of the account, put into native dress. Well, there are such cases, and we can usually identify them. Here's one from Western Australia, in the Fitzroy area. Quote, during the Dreamtime flood, Waramba, the Ark Gomana carrying Noah, Aborigines, and animals drifted south and came to rest in the floodplain of Gillimbadu, about 70 kilometers south of Nunkamba Station, just south of the Barbed Wire Range and east of the Worrell Range, where it can still be seen today. The white man's claim that it landed in the Middle East was a lie to keep Aborigines in subservience. End quote. The clues are right here. Terms like Noah and Ark, and resentment of the missionaries. If there is any genuine ethnic memory here, it's too well buried to be recovered. But there are many others that have a ring of authenticity. Take this one from Hawaii. Quote, Nu'u was of the 13th generation from the first man. The gods commanded Nu'u to build an ark and carry on it his wife, 3 sons, and males and females of all breathing things. Waters came and covered the earth. They subsided to leave the ark on a mountain overlooking a beautiful valley. The gods entered the ark and told Nu'u to go forth with all the life it carried. In gratitude for his deliverance, Nu'u offered a sacrifice of pig, coconuts, and awa to the moon, which he thought was the god Kane. Kane descended on a rainbow to reproach Nu'u for his mistake, but left the rainbow as a perpetual sign of his forgiveness. End quote. Note the details. Nu'u, 13 generations from creation. An ark with wife and 3 sons. Pairs of breathing animals. Landing on a mountain. And a rainbow. But interspersed are native elements, like the corruption of the name Noah, the items sacrificed, and the god it identifies. Just one such story, though, but there are many more. Here's one from Central Asia. Quote, Nama, a good man, lived with 3 sons, Sozanul, Sarul, and Balix. Ilgen commanded Nama to build an ark, Kareb, but Nama's sight was failing, so he left the building to his sons. The ark was built on a mountain. Nama entered the ark with his family and the various animals and birds which had been driven there by the rising waters. 7 days later, Nama told his eldest son to open the window and look around, and the son saw only the summits of mountains. His father ordered him to look again later, and he saw only water and sky. At last, the ark stopped in a group of 8 mountains. On successive days, Nama released a raven, a crow, and a rook, none of which returned. On the 4th day, he sent out a dove, which returned with a birch twig. End quote. And so on. See the Slavic names? But so many details that are close but not precisely accurate, characteristic of an oral tradition growing from something real. And how about Northern Europe? Quote, from his heavenly window, The supreme god, Pramzimas, saw nothing but war and injustice among mankind. He sent 2 giants, Wandu and Wehas, water and wind, to destroy the earth. After 20 days and nights, little was left. Pramzimas looked to see the progress. He happened to be eating nuts at the time, and he threw down the shells. One happened to land on the peak of the tallest mountain, where some people and animals had sought refuge. Everybody climbed in and survived the flood, floating in the nutshell. God's wrath abated. He ordered the wind and water to abate. The people dispersed, except for one elderly couple who stayed where they landed. To comfort them, God sent the rainbow and advised them to jump over the bones of the earth 9 times. They did so, and up sprang 9 other couples, from which the 9 Lithuanian tribes descended." End quote. There we see the moral element. God detests the corruption of mankind, but it's mixed with the frivolous, as he tosses down nutshells, accidentally saving humans and animals. But he's kind enough to send the rainbow. From the Old World we can go to the New and Mexico. When mankind were overwhelmed with the deluge, none were preserved but a man named Coxcox and a woman named Xochiquetzal, who saved themselves in a little bark, and having afterwards got to land upon a mountain called by them Colhuacan, had there a great many children. These children were all born dumb, until a dove from a lofty tree imparted to them languages, but differing so much that they could not understand one another. End quote. Local names appear here again, but the skeleton of the tale is there, distorted by time. The dove even survives, but is given a different role. And there is even an echo of the confusion of languages that took place at Babel. Let's go into South America for an Inca tale. Quote, "Pictorial records of ancient Incan rulers show that a flood rose above the highest mountains. All created things perished, except for a man and woman who floated in a box. When the flood subsided, the floating box was driven by the wind to Tiahuanaco, about 200 miles from Cusco, where the Creator told them to dwell." End quote. Notice that we're reading a description of Incan art, depicting events that had already been shaped in oral tradition before the Inca rulers recorded it. But as you see, it recalled a universal flood, not a local one. All created things perished. Or we can go to the African continent for a Maasai tale. This one is reported by Sir James George Fraser, the famous expert on folklore. Quote, "God resolved to destroy mankind, except Tumbainot found grace in his eyes. God commanded Tumbainot to build an ark of wood and enter it with his 2 wives, 6 sons, and their wives, and some of the animals of every sort. God caused a great long rain which caused a flood, and all other men and beasts drowned. The rain finally stopped, and Tumbainot let loose a dove. The dove returned tired, so Tumbainot knew it had found no place to rest. Several days later, he loosed a vulture, but first he attached an arrow to one of its tail feathers. The vulture returned that evening without the arrow, so Tumbainot reasoned that the flood was receding. When the water ran away, the ark grounded on the steppe, and its occupants disembarked. Tumbainot saw 4 rainbows, one in each quarter of the sky, signifying that God's wrath was over." End quote. Here the father has 6 sons. and a vulture, often prominent in African tales, gets a role. But the framework of the biblical story is there. This series of legends could go on, but perhaps a chart showing some of them would be more helpful. Here are tales from Assyrio-Babylonia, Persia, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, Egypt, Italy, Lithuania, Russia, China, India, the Cree of Canada and the Cherokee of the U.S., the Papagoa and Aztecs of Mexico, plus Peru, the Leeward Islands, Fiji, and Hawaii. And this is only a sampling. The x-axis notes details of the biblical account that are present in each of those tales, with an indication whether the full element or only a portion of it is referenced. Notice how much green and orange one sees. So after this brief tour of the legends of the world, what have we seen? Over and over, we find a memory, fragmentary, distorted, or embellished, of a great flood sent by a God that destroyed the world, but preserved a family and the animals. One or two such stories we might discount, but 270 of them? Maybe that flood in the Bible actually happened, after all. If you have questions about this lecture, or any of the others in the Good Answers series, you may address them to me, Dr. Jerry C. 4 at yahoo.com.